Sarah Martinez, 28. 3 months ago, I was homeless, sleeping in my car, while my own family celebrated getting rid of me. They called me a pathetic failure who would never amount to anything. But last Tuesday night, while they were having their weekly family dinner without me, the President of the United States said my name on live television and called me an American hero. My phone exploded with 847 missed calls from the same family members who had blocked my number. My brother, the hotshot lawyer who led the charge to kick me out, left a voicemail crying and begging me to call him back. My mother, who said I was an embarrassment to the family name, posted on Facebook about how proud she was of her brilliant daughter. But here's what they don't know yet. Everything they thought they knew about me was a lie. And the real reason I let them destroy me will blow your mind. Ever felt invisible in your own home? I have. Before we continue, please subscribe. Growing up in the Martinez household meant living in a constant competition where I was always coming in last place. My older brother Miguel was the golden child. Harvard Law School, 6-figure salary at 26, the kind of son who made my parents beam with pride at every family gathering. Then there was my younger sister Carmen, the creative genius who turned her photography hobby into a thriving business with celebrity clients and magazine features. And then there was me, Sarah, the middle child who somehow managed to disappoint everyone without even trying. While Miguel was arguing cases in downtown law firms and Carmen was jet-setting to photo shoots in Milan, I was working as a GS11 data analyst for the Department of Treasury. To my family, this wasn't a respectable government job. It was proof that I had settled for mediocrity. Every Sunday dinner became an interrogation about why I wasn't more ambitious, why I wasn't making more money, why I seemed content with what they saw as a dead-end career shuffling paperwork in a windowless office. My father, a successful contractor who built his business from nothing, would shake his head whenever I mentioned my work. "Mija, you're wasting your brain pushing papers around," he'd say, his disappointment hanging heavy in the air. "Look at your brother. He's changing people's lives, fighting for justice. Look at your sister. She's an artist, creating beauty in the world. What are you creating? What are you fighting for?" I wanted to tell him that data analysis was important, that the work I did helped track government spending and identify fraud. But every time I tried to explain, I could see his eyes glaze over with boredom. My mother was even worse. She worked as a nurse and had always pushed all three of us to pursue careers that would make her proud to brag to her colleagues. Miguel's legal victories and Carmen's magazine spreads gave her endless material for small talk in the hospital break room. But when people asked about me, I could see her struggle to find something positive to say. "Sarah works for the government," she'd offer weakly, as if those words alone would somehow impress people. The worst part wasn't even their disappointment. It was their pity. They treated me like I was fragile, like I might break if they pushed too hard. Miguel would slip me money at family gatherings, claiming it was for gas, but really because he assumed I was struggling financially. Carmen would invite me to her gallery openings and introduce me to people as her sweet sister who works so hard, emphasizing the word hard, as if effort could somehow compensate for lack of achievement. During family photos, I always ended up in the back or to the side, never in the center where Miguel and Carmen naturally gravitated. At restaurants, servers would instinctively hand them the wine list and dessert menus, somehow sensing that they were the successful ones worth impressing. I became the family footnote, the sister who was doing fine, while her siblings were conquering the world. What hurt most was that I actually loved my job. The thrill of finding patterns in massive data sets, the satisfaction of catching discrepancies that others missed, the quiet pride of knowing that my work helped protect taxpayer money, none of that mattered to my family. To them, if it wasn't glamorous or lucrative, it wasn't worth their respect. They saw my contentment as complacency, my dedication as settling for less, and slowly I began to believe them. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when my supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, called me into her cramped office that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and stress. Janet was one of those government lifers who had seen everything twice and trusted nothing at face value. She had worked her way up from data entry to department head over 23 years, and her gray hair and permanent frown lines told the story of countless budget battles and bureaucratic nightmares. "Sarah, "I've got something different for you," she said, sliding a thick manila folder across her desk. The folder was unmarked except for a red stamp that read Priority Reconciliation. Inside were hundreds of pages of financial reports, transaction logs, and spreadsheets that looked mind-numbingly boring even by Treasury Department standards. "We've got discrepancies across multiple agencies, nothing's adding up, and 3 different analysts have already thrown in the towel on this one." The assignment was supposed to be routine. Reconcile federal spending reports between the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and State Department for the previous 18 months. On paper, it looked like standard bureaucratic confusion, the kind of paperwork nightmare that happened when different agencies used different accounting systems and nobody bothered to make them talk to each other properly. The kind of project that would make most people's eyes glaze over within the first hour. But as I started digging into the numbers, something felt off. Small amounts were missing from multiple budgets, never enough to trigger automatic audits, but consistent enough to create a pattern. 100,000 here, 200,000 there, all classified under vague categories like operational expenses and contractor services. Most analysts would have written it off as clerical errors or system glitches, but I had always been obsessive about details that others overlooked. I spent the next 2 weeks building spreadsheets and cross-referencing data, staying late in the office while the cleaning crew vacuumed around my desk. The fluorescent lights would buzz overhead as I traced money trails through dozens of accounts, mapping out connections that shouldn't exist. What started as random discrepancies began forming a picture that made my stomach turn. Money was being systematically siphoned from legitimate government contracts and rerouted through a network of shell companies. The deeper I dug, the more complex the scheme became. Defense contracts for equipment that was never delivered, Homeland Security payments to consulting firms that existed only on paper. State Department funds disappearing into offshore accounts registered to companies with addresses that turned out to be empty lots or abandoned buildings. Someone had built an incredibly sophisticated system to steal millions of dollars in taxpayer money, and they had been doing it for years. What scared me most was how carefully hidden it all was. This wasn't the work of some low-level clerk skimming petty cash. This required access to multiple high-security systems, knowledge of federal contracting procedures, and connections at the highest levels of government. Whoever was behind this had serious power and resources, which meant they also had the ability to make problems disappear. By the end of the month, I had documented over $47 million in fraudulent transactions. The evidence was sitting in my locked desk drawer in a folder that had grown from 1 inch thick to nearly 6 inches. Every night, I would drive home to my tiny apartment wondering if I was in over my head, but I couldn't stop digging. This was exactly the kind of work I had always dreamed of doing, using my skills to protect the public good, even if nobody would ever know my name. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday night in April. I had been working late again, surviving on vending machine coffee and the determination that comes from knowing you're onto something big. Most of the office building was empty except for security guards and the occasional workaholic like me. The silence was broken only by the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I was cross-referencing a series of payments made to something called Patriot Solutions LLC, when I noticed the same bank routing number appearing in transactions across 3 different agencies. Patriot Solutions had received over $12 million in the past year for various consulting services, but when I tried to verify the company's legitimacy, I hit dead end after dead end. Their business license was registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. Their website was a single page with stock photos and generic language about strategic consulting solutions. Their phone number led to a voicemail that was never returned. But that routing number was the key that unlocked everything. It belonged to First Caribbean Trust, a bank in the Cayman Islands that specialized in what they politely called privacy-focused financial services. From there, I was able to trace a web of interconnected shell companies, each one designed to obscure the trail of stolen money. Patriot Solutions fed money to Atlantic Defense Consulting, which transferred funds to Global Security Partners, which ultimately sent everything to numbered accounts in banks that didn't ask questions about where the money came from. The sophistication of the operation was breathtaking. Whoever had designed this system understood federal contracting procedures better than most government employees. They knew exactly how much money they could steal without triggering automatic audits. They had contacts inside multiple agencies who could approve payments without proper oversight. They had created fake companies with legitimate-sounding names and forged documentation that would fool casual inspection. As I mapped out the entire network, I realized I was looking at the largest government fraud scheme I had ever seen. This wasn't just about money, it was about national security. Defense contracts that were never fulfilled meant soldiers potentially going without equipment they needed. Homeland Security funds that disappeared meant resources unavailable for protecting American citizens. The thieves weren't just stealing from taxpayers, they were potentially putting lives at risk. The scariest part was discovering how high up the corruption went. Some of the approved payments bore the digital signatures of senior officials in multiple departments. Either these people were complicit in the fraud, or someone had gained unauthorized access to their credentials. Either scenario suggested that the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government, involving people with serious power and influence. I printed everything and made multiple copies, storing them in different locations. One set went into a safety deposit box at my bank. Another went to my apartment, hidden inside a folder labeled Tax Documents 2019 to 2023. A third set stayed locked in my desk at work. I wasn't paranoid, but I wasn't stupid either. People had killed for a lot less than $47 million, and I was now the only person who could connect all the dots. The weight of what I had discovered kept me awake at night. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what to do next. This was bigger than anything my small department was equipped to handle. It would require investigation by the FBI, congressional oversight, and probably multiple prosecutions. But it would also destroy the careers of everyone involved, and some of those people might be innocent victims who had unknowingly signed off on fraudulent documents. By May, I had documented the theft of over $63 million and identified at least 15 government officials whose credentials had been used to approve fraudulent payments. I was sitting on evidence that could bring down multiple high-ranking officials and expose systemic corruption across several federal agencies, and I was terrified that someone was going to figure out what I knew before I could decide what to do about it. The first sign that someone was watching me came on a Monday morning when I arrived at work to find my computer had been updated over the weekend. It claimed it was routine maintenance, but 3 of my most important spreadsheets had corrupted data that would take hours to reconstruct. When I checked my backup files on the shared server, they had mysteriously disappeared too. The IT technician, a nervous kid named Danny who had always been helpful before, avoided eye contact and mumbled something about system glitches. That same week, my keycard started malfunctioning. I would badge into the building in the morning only to find that my access had been temporarily suspended for security verification. It happened 3 times in 5 days, each time requiring me to wait in the lobby while security called my supervisor to confirm my identity. Janet seemed as confused as I was, but she suggested I keep a low profile and avoid working late until they figured out what was causing the technical issues. The problems escalated quickly. Files from my investigation would randomly disappear from my desk, only to reappear the next day in slightly different locations. My computer would freeze whenever I tried to access certain financial databases. Phone calls to verify information about the shell companies I had identified would mysteriously drop or connect to numbers that had been disconnected. Someone was systematically sabotaging my work, and they were being subtle enough about it that I couldn't prove it was intentional. The breaking point came when I tried to make copies of my evidence at the office copy machine. Halfway through printing a crucial batch of documents, the machine jammed and somehow managed to shred 3 pages of irreplaceable bank records. The repair technician who arrived within minutes seemed to know exactly which papers had been destroyed, asking me specific questions about those financial reports I had been copying. When I asked how he knew what I had been printing, he claimed lucky guess and quickly finished his work. That evening, as I was leaving the building, a man in an expensive suit approached me in the parking garage. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of confident demeanor that comes from wielding serious power. He knew my name, my address, and somehow even knew that I drove a blue Honda Civic with a small dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot accident 6 months earlier. "Sarah Martinez," he said, his voice friendly but carrying an undertone that made my blood run cold. "I hear you've been working very hard lately. Sometimes it's important to know when to take a break, don't you think? All work and no play can lead to stress, and stress can cause people to see patterns that aren't really there." He handed me his business card, which identified him as Robert Chen, Senior Policy Advisor for something called the Federal Efficiency Initiative. "If you ever need someone to talk to about managing workload pressures, please don't hesitate to call." I drove home that night checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, convinced I was being followed. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door containing photocopies of my phone records, my credit card statements, and a detailed schedule of my daily routines. There was no note, but the message was clear. They knew everything about my life, and they could reach me anywhere. At work, the pressure intensified. Janet called me into her office to tell me that my investigation had been reassigned to a more senior analyst. When I asked why, she couldn't give me a straight answer, just repeated that it was above my pay grade and that I should focus on more routine assignments. The thick folder containing months of my research disappeared from my locked desk drawer that same afternoon. By June, I was jumping at shadows and questioning my own sanity. Maybe the man in the parking garage was right. Maybe I was seeing patterns that weren't really there. Maybe the technical problems were just coincidences. Maybe I was letting my imagination run wild because I desperately wanted my boring job to matter. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had stumbled onto something massive, and powerful people were trying to make me back down before I could expose them. The annual Martinez family barbecue in July should have been a celebration. Miguel had just made partner at his law firm, landing a corner office and a salary that made my government paycheck look like pocket money. Carmen had been featured in Vogue's Photographers to Watch list, complete with a 2-page spread showcasing her latest celebrity portraits. My parents were practically glowing with pride as relatives and family friends congratulated them on raising such successful children. I arrived at my parents' house in Riverside carrying a store-bought potato salad and the weight of everything I couldn't tell anyone. For 3 months, I had been living with the knowledge that I had uncovered the biggest government fraud in decades, but I couldn't share it with the people who mattered most to me. The intimidation campaign at work had intensified to the point where I was afraid to use my office computer for anything beyond the most basic tasks. I was sleeping poorly, jumping at every unexpected noise, and starting to wonder if I was losing my mind. The backyard was filled with the usual crowd, aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who had watched us grow up. Miguel was holding court near the grill, regaling everyone with stories about his latest case involving a Fortune 500 company. He looked every inch the successful lawyer in his designer polo shirt and expensive watch, gesturing confidently as people hung on his every word. Carmen was showing off photos from her recent shoot with a Grammy-winning musician, her artistic eye evident in every perfectly composed image. And then there was me, sitting at the plastic patio table with my younger cousins, trying to pretend I belonged in this celebration of achievement. When Uncle Roberto asked about my work, I felt the familiar knot in my stomach. "I'm doing some interesting financial analysis for the Treasury Department," I said, trying to inject enthusiasm into my voice. "Actually, I've been working on something really important that could make a huge difference." The conversation around the table quieted as people turned to listen, and for a moment I felt the intoxicating possibility of finally sharing what I had discovered. "I've been investigating some irregularities in government spending," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "There's evidence of systematic fraud across multiple agencies. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars being stolen from taxpayers through fake contracts and shell companies." Miguel laughed. Not unkindly, but with the condescension of someone who assumed I was exaggerating to make my job sound more exciting. "Sarah, honey, you're analyzing spreadsheets, not uncovering some massive conspiracy. Don't you think the FBI would have noticed if there was really fraud on that scale?" Carmen nodded in agreement, adding, "Maybe you're seeing patterns that aren't really there. Sometimes when work gets boring, our imagination tries to make it more interesting than it actually is." The dismissal stung, but what came next was worse. My mother, clearly embarrassed by what she saw as my desperate attempt to make my mundane job sound important, put her hand on my shoulder with that patronizing smile I had come to dread. Mija, we're proud that you work hard, but maybe you shouldn't get so caught up in these theories. You know how you can get obsessed with details that don't really matter in the big picture. My father nodded sagely, as if he was sharing profound wisdom. Sarah, your problem has always been that you focus too much on small things instead of seeing the forest for the trees. Miguel fights for justice in real cases with real people. Carmen creates beauty that inspires others, but you're chasing numbers on a computer screen, looking for problems that probably don't exist. The worst part was seeing the looks of pity and embarrassment on the faces of our extended family. These were people who had watched me grow up, who had once believed I might achieve something meaningful with my life. Now they were witnessing what they saw as a desperate woman trying to inflate her boring job into something significant. I could practically hear them thinking, poor Sarah, still trying to compete with her successful siblings. I spent the rest of the barbecue in humiliated silence, watching my family celebrate achievements that felt hollow compared to what I was risking my safety to expose. But I couldn't tell them about the intimidation, the threats, or the real importance of my work without sounding even more paranoid and delusional. I was completely alone with the truth, and my own family had just made it clear they would never believe me. 3 weeks after the barbecue disaster, my world completely collapsed. I arrived at work on a Tuesday morning to find Janet waiting by my desk with a security guard and someone from Human Resources I didn't recognize. The woman from HR, a stern-looking blonde in her 40s, introduced herself as Patricia Williams and explained that my employment was being terminated effective immediately due to performance issues and concerns about workplace conduct. The performance issues were supposedly based on complaints that I had been obsessing over routine assignments and disrupting normal workflow with unnecessary questions and requests. The workplace conduct concerns centered around allegations that I had been accessing databases beyond my clearance level and making inappropriate inquiries about classified financial information. None of it was true, but I had no way to prove it. My access to work computers had been so restricted over the past month that I could barely do basic data entry, let alone the advanced analysis they were accusing me of. Janet looked genuinely confused by the whole process, clearly out of the loop about why her most dedicated analyst was being fired. She tried to advocate for me, pointing out my excellent performance reviews and the quality of my work, but Patricia Williams cut her off with bureaucratic efficiency. "This decision comes from above my pay grade," she said, a phrase that had become all too familiar. "Ms. Martinez needs to collect her personal items and leave the building within the hour." As I cleaned out my desk under the watchful eye of the security guard, I realized that all evidence of my investigation had already been removed. The backup files I had hidden in various folders were gone. The notebooks where I had sketched out connections between shell companies had disappeared. Even my personal items seemed to have been searched and reorganized. Someone had systematically erased every trace of my months of work, leaving me with nothing but my memories and the copies I had hidden outside the office. The drive home was a blur of rage and disbelief. I had dedicated 2 years of my life to that job, working late nights and weekends because I genuinely believed in the mission of protecting taxpayer money. Now I was unemployed, blacklisted from government work, and sitting on evidence of massive corruption that I couldn't prove because all my supporting documentation had been confiscated or destroyed. That evening, my mother called with what she clearly thought was going to be a supportive conversation. "Mija, maybe this is a blessing in disguise," she said, in the tone she used when she was trying to find the silver lining in my failures. "You've been so stressed about that job lately, always talking about conspiracies and corruption. Maybe now you can find something that makes you happier." When I tried to explain that I had been fired for discovering actual fraud, she sighed in the way that meant she thought I was being dramatic. "Sarah, honey, if there was really corruption on the scale you're talking about, don't you think other people would have noticed? You're not the only smart person working for the government. Sometimes when we're unhappy with our lives, we create these elaborate stories to make ourselves feel more important." The conversation with my father was even worse. He listened patiently as I tried to explain what had happened, then delivered his verdict with the certainty of someone who thought he understood the world better than his confused daughter. Sarah, you need to face reality. You got fired because you weren't doing your job properly. Instead of focusing on your actual responsibilities, you were chasing fantasies about being some kind of detective or whistleblower. That's not how the real world works. 2 days later, Miguel called with what he described as a family intervention. He had talked to our parents and Carmen, and they had all agreed that I needed tough love to get my life back on track. They wanted me to come to Sunday dinner so we could have an honest conversation about my future. The phrase honest conversation coming from Miguel's mouth made my stomach turn, because I knew it meant they had already decided what was wrong with me and what I needed to do to fix it. I should have known better than to go, but I was desperate for family support during the worst crisis of my life. I showed up at my parents' house on Sunday evening, hoping against hope that somehow they would listen to me, believe me, and help me figure out what to do next. Instead, I walked into an ambush that would destroy what was left of my relationship with the people I loved most. The intervention took place in my parents' living room, the same space where we had opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays for 28 years. But that Sunday evening, it felt like a courtroom where I was the defendant facing a jury that had already reached their verdict. Miguel sat in the big armchair that had always been my father's spot, his lawyer persona in full effect as he prepared to present the case against me. Carmen perched on the edge of the couch, looking uncomfortable but determined to support what the family had decided was necessary. My parents flanked them like reinforcements, their faces wearing expressions of disappointed concern that I had seen too many times before. Miguel started with what he clearly thought was a gentle approach, speaking in the measured tones he probably used with clients who were about to receive bad news. Sarah, we're all here because we love you and we're worried about you. Over the past few months, you've been talking about conspiracy theories, claiming that you've uncovered some massive government fraud that somehow nobody else has noticed. Then you got fired from your job, and instead of taking responsibility for your performance issues, you're blaming it on some elaborate cover-up. Carmen jumped in with her version of supportive sisterly advice. We know you've always felt like you had something to prove because Miguel and I have been more visible with our successes. But you don't need to create these dramatic stories about being some kind of whistleblower to make your life seem more important. You're smart and capable, but you need to focus on realistic goals instead of these fantasies. My mother delivered the emotional appeal, her voice heavy with the kind of maternal disappointment that had shaped my entire childhood. Mija, we've watched you become more and more isolated, more paranoid, more convinced that everyone is against you. That's not healthy behavior. You need to accept that maybe your job performance wasn't as good as you thought, and maybe the patterns you think you found in those numbers were just mistakes or coincidences. But it was my father who delivered the final blow, speaking with the authority of someone who had built a successful business through hard work and practical thinking. Sarah, you're 28 years old, and you're still acting like a child who makes up stories when things don't go your way. You got fired because you weren't doing your job properly, period. All this talk about corruption and cover-ups is just your way of avoiding responsibility for your own failures. When I tried to defend myself, to explain that I had documented evidence of systematic fraud, Miguel cut me off with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to control a courtroom. Sarah, stop. Just stop. Do you have any idea how crazy you sound right now? You're claiming to have uncovered a massive conspiracy that somehow the FBI, Congress, and multiple government agencies have all missed. Does that seem reasonable to you? The room fell silent as they waited for me to acknowledge that they were right, that I had been delusional, that I needed to accept their version of reality. Instead, I felt something break inside me. Not just my heart, but my faith in the people who were supposed to know me better than anyone else in the world. These were the people who had raised me, who had seen me grow up, who should have recognized that I wasn't the type of person to make up elaborate lies for attention. Carmen tried to soften the blow with what she probably thought was constructive advice. We think you should move out of your apartment and stay somewhere cheaper while you figure things out. Maybe get some counseling to help you process why you created these stories about your job, and definitely stay away from government work. Clearly, that environment wasn't healthy for you. My father nodded in agreement, already planning my life like I was a teenager who had gotten in trouble at school. You can stay in the guest room for a couple of weeks while you look for a new place and a new job. But Sarah, you need to understand that we can't enable this behavior anymore. No more conspiracy theories, no more claims about being some kind of hero who discovered corruption. You need to face reality and start acting like an adult. The final insult came when Miguel pulled out his checkbook, clearly intending to write me money like I was a charity case who needed their financial support to survive. We'll help you get back on your feet financially, but only if you commit to getting your life together. That means no more of this whistleblower nonsense, no more paranoid behavior, and definitely no more embarrassing the family with these ridiculous claims about government fraud. I looked around the room at the faces of the people who had shaped my entire world, and I realized that they would never believe me. No matter what evidence I showed them, no matter what happened in the future, they had decided that I was the problem. I was the family failure who had finally snapped under the pressure of not measuring up to my successful siblings. I was the pathetic middle child who had invented a fantasy about being important because I couldn't handle being ordinary. I stood up from the couch, my legs shaking with a combination of rage and heartbreak that I had never experienced before. You know what? You're right. I need to leave and figure things out on my own. I walked toward the door, pausing only to look back at the family that had just disowned me. But someday, when the truth comes out, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that when I needed you most, you chose to believe that I was crazy instead of trusting that I might actually know what I was talking about. The Motel 6 in Pomona became my home for the next 2 months, a depressing testament to how far my life had fallen in just a few weeks. The room smelled like industrial disinfectant and stale cigarettes, with thin walls that let me hear every argument, crying baby, and late-night television show from my neighbors. I had paid for 3 weeks up front using the last of my savings, sleeping on sheets that felt like sandpaper, and eating dollar menu meals because that was all I could afford. Every morning, I would sit on the edge of the sagging mattress and stare at the copies of my investigation that I had hidden in various places before losing my job. The evidence was all there. The shell companies, the fraudulent contracts, the money trails leading to offshore accounts. But without my position at Treasury and access to federal databases, I couldn't prove any of it. To anyone else, these looked like random financial documents that could have been fabricated by someone with a good imagination and access to a printer. The unemployment office was a special kind of humiliation. Sitting in plastic chairs with dozens of other people who had lost their jobs, filling out forms that asked why I was terminated from my previous position. I couldn't exactly write "fired for uncovering massive government corruption" without sounding delusional, so I checked the box for performance issues and watched my self-respect die a little more each day. Job hunting was even worse. My government security clearance had been revoked as part of my termination, which eliminated most of the positions I was qualified for. Private sector accounting firms wanted experience with different software systems than what the government used. Every interview ended the same way, promising to call me back, then silence. I started to wonder if someone was actively sabotaging my job search, or if I was just paranoid from months of stress and isolation. The loneliness was the worst part. I had never realized how much of my social life revolved around family until they were gone. My few friends from college had scattered across the country for careers and marriages, leaving me with acquaintances from work who suddenly stopped returning my calls after I was fired. I would go entire days without speaking to another human being except for brief interactions with cashiers and fast food workers. At night, lying in that terrible motel bed, I would replay every conversation with my family, looking for signs that I could have handled things differently. Maybe if I had been more careful about how I presented my findings. Maybe if I had waited until I had more concrete proof before saying anything. Maybe if I had been a better daughter, they would have trusted me enough to listen. The self-doubt ate away at my confidence until I started to wonder if they were right about everything. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in September when I opened my laptop to find an email from my landlord demanding the rest of my security deposit because of damage to my apartment that I knew didn't exist. The same day, my car insurance was canceled for a missed payment that I was sure I had made on time. My bank account showed a balance of $47.32, barely enough to survive another week at the motel. I sat in that depressing room, surrounded by evidence of the biggest government fraud in decades, completely powerless to do anything about it. I had lost my job, my family, my home, and my future because I had tried to do the right thing. The people who were stealing millions of dollars from taxpayers were still free, still powerful, still destroying lives, while I couldn't even afford to eat properly. For the first time since this nightmare began, I seriously considered giving up. I could throw away all my evidence, find some minimum wage job, and try to rebuild my life from scratch. Maybe my family would eventually forgive me if I admitted they were right, if I accepted that I had been delusional and promised to never mention corruption again. Maybe I could go back to being ordinary Sarah Martinez, the disappointing middle child who worked boring jobs and never caused trouble. But as I held those documents in my hands, thinking about feeding them into the motel's paper shredder, I realized I couldn't do it. $63 million of taxpayer money had been stolen. Government officials were either corrupt or incompetent. American citizens were being betrayed by the people they trusted to protect their interests. I might be powerless and alone, but I was still the only person who knew the truth. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to make sure that truth saw the light of day. The decision to go public came at 3 a.m. on a sleepless Wednesday night in October. I had been staring at the ceiling of my motel room, listening to a domestic argument through the thin walls, when I realized I had nothing left to lose. My family had abandoned me, my career was destroyed, and I was 3 days away from being homeless. The people who had tried to silence me had already taken everything they could from me: my job, my reputation, my relationships. The only thing they couldn't take was the truth, and I was done protecting them by keeping quiet. I spent the next morning at the public library, using their computers to research investigative journalists who specialized in government corruption. I needed someone with credibility, resources, and the courage to take on powerful people. After hours of reading articles and watching interviews, I identified 3 reporters who seemed like they might be willing to listen. Marcus Chen at the Washington Post, who had won a Pulitzer for exposing defense contractor fraud. Jennifer Walsh at 60 Minutes, who had a reputation for taking down corrupt politicians. And David Kim at ProPublica, whose investigations had led to congressional hearings and criminal prosecutions. The first challenge was getting their attention. I couldn't just send an email claiming to have evidence of massive government fraud. They probably received dozens of conspiracy theory tips every week from people who thought they had uncovered the next Watergate. I needed to provide enough specific details to prove I was legitimate without revealing everything in an unsecured communication that could be intercepted by the same people who had been monitoring my work activities. I crafted carefully worded messages that mentioned specific shell company names, dollar amounts, and dates without explaining how they connected. To Marcus Chen, I wrote about Patriot Solutions LLC and their $12 million in questionable contracts. To Jennifer Walsh, I described the Cayman Islands bank routing numbers that appeared in multiple agency transactions. To David Kim, I outlined the pattern of fraudulent consulting payments across defense, Homeland Security, and State Department budgets. Each message ended with the same offer. I have documented evidence of systematic fraud totaling over $60 million in federal funds. I am a former Treasury Department analyst who was terminated for investigating these discrepancies. If you are interested in pursuing this story, I can provide bank records, contract documents, and a detailed timeline showing how this scheme has operated for at least 18 months. The waiting was agony. I checked my email every few hours at the library, hoping for some sign that someone was taking me seriously. Days passed with nothing but automated replies and spam. I started to wonder if my messages were even reaching their intended recipients, or if someone was intercepting them before they could be read. The paranoia that had been building for months reached new heights as I imagined government agents monitoring every keystroke, blocking every attempt to expose the truth. Meanwhile, my situation continued to deteriorate. The motel manager informed me that my rate was increasing because I had been there longer than the weekly discount period allowed. My car started making concerning noises that I couldn't afford to have diagnosed, let alone repaired. I was surviving on ramen noodles and whatever free food I could find at community events, losing weight and developing a persistent cough from the stress and poor living conditions. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Instead of hearing back from one of the high-profile journalists I had contacted, I received a response from an FBI agent named Special Agent Maria Santos, who worked in the Financial Crimes Division. Apparently, David Kim at ProPublica had forwarded my information to federal law enforcement as part of his standard practice when receiving tips about potential criminal activity. Agent Santos wanted to meet in person to discuss my allegations. Her email was professional but cautious, asking me to bring any evidence I had and warning me about the serious legal implications of making false statements to federal investigators. She suggested meeting at a Starbucks in downtown Los Angeles, neutral territory, where we could talk without drawing attention from either criminals or nosy civilians. As I prepared for the meeting that could either vindicate everything I had been through or land me in federal prison for making false claims, I realized that this was my last chance. If Agent Santos didn't believe me, if the FBI decided I was just another delusional conspiracy theorist, then I would have no choice but to give up and try to rebuild my life from the ruins. But if she listened, if she understood the significance of what I had discovered, then maybe all the suffering and isolation would finally mean something. I gathered every piece of evidence I had managed to save, organized it into a presentation that would make sense to someone seeing it for the first time, and prepared to bet my entire future on the hope that at least one person in authority would believe that Sarah Martinez, the family failure, had actually uncovered something worth destroying her life to expose. The meeting with Special Agent Santos changed everything and nothing all at once. She turned out to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as I spread my evidence across the small table in the back corner of the Starbucks. For 2 hours, she listened without interruption as I walked her through the shell companies, the fraudulent contracts, and the money trails that led to offshore accounts. She asked sharp questions that proved she understood financial crimes, took detailed notes, and photographed every document with a careful precision that gave me hope. When I finished my presentation, Agent Santos was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers with the intensity of someone who recognized their significance. "Ms. Martinez," she finally said, "if even half of what you're showing me is accurate, we're looking at one of the largest government fraud cases in recent history. But I need you to understand that this investigation could take months or even years to complete. These are serious allegations against powerful people, and we have to build an airtight case." She explained that the FBI would need to verify my evidence independently, which meant subpoenaing bank records, interviewing government officials, and potentially conducting undercover operations to gather additional proof. My role would be limited to providing testimony and answering questions. I wouldn't be involved in the active investigation, and I definitely wouldn't see any immediate results. The people I had identified as part of the conspiracy would continue their normal lives while federal agents quietly built cases against them. The waiting period that followed was perhaps the most difficult part of my entire ordeal. Agent Santos had warned me to maintain a low profile and avoid discussing the case with anyone, which meant continuing to live like a disgraced former government employee who had been fired for performance issues. I found a part-time job stocking shelves at a grocery store in Riverside, work that paid barely enough to cover rent on a studio apartment in a neighborhood where car alarms went off regularly and the walls were thin enough to hear every conversation from the units next door. My family remained completely out of my life. I would occasionally see updates on their social media, Miguel winning another case, Carmen getting featured in another magazine, my parents posting proud grandparent photos with Miguel's children, but I was invisible in their world. They had blocked my phone number and apparently told extended family members that I was going through some personal issues and needed space to figure things out. The official family narrative seemed to be that I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and would hopefully get the help I needed. The isolation was devastating, but what kept me going was the knowledge that somewhere in Los Angeles, FBI agents were following the leads I had provided. Every few weeks, Agent Santos would call with brief updates that couldn't include specific details but confirmed that the investigation was progressing. "We've corroborated several of your findings," she told me in November. "The case is expanding beyond what you originally uncovered." In December, "We've made some significant breakthroughs that I can't discuss yet." In January, "Things are moving faster than we expected." During those months, I learned to live with constant anxiety about what would happen when the case finally went public. Would my family believe me then, or would they find new ways to minimize my role? Would I be able to find decent work again, or would I be forever marked as the whistleblower who had brought down powerful people? Would the criminals I had exposed try to retaliate against me once they realized I was the source of their downfall? I also struggled with guilt about the investigation's secrecy. Every day that passed meant more taxpayer money potentially being stolen, more contracts being awarded to fake companies, more betrayal of public trust. I understood why the FBI needed time to build solid cases, but it was painful to know that the corruption was continuing while I stocked cereal boxes and tried to stretch my paycheck to cover basic living expenses. The media attention began slowly in February, starting with vague reports about federal investigations into defense contracting irregularities. I would read these articles with my heart pounding, looking for any sign that my evidence was becoming public knowledge, but the stories were carefully worded to avoid identifying specific companies or individuals, clearly reflecting ongoing law enforcement sensitivities about protecting active investigations. By March, the coverage was becoming more specific. ProPublica published a detailed examination of shell companies receiving federal contracts, including several that I had identified in my original research. The Washington Post ran a series about oversight failures in government spending. 60 Minutes aired a segment about defense contractor fraud that featured interviews with unnamed federal investigators. I knew that my evidence was driving these stories, but my name never appeared in any of the coverage. Then Agent Santos called with news that made my hands shake as I answered the phone. "Ms. Martinez, I need you to prepare yourself. Things are about to move very quickly. We're going to begin making arrests next week, and once that happens, your identity as the original source will likely become public knowledge. Are you ready for your life to change completely?" The first arrests happened on a Tuesday morning in April, and by noon, my phone was ringing nonstop with calls from reporters who had somehow gotten my number. The FBI had taken down 12 people in coordinated raids across Washington, D.C., including 2 senior officials at the Department of Defense, a deputy director at Homeland Security, and the CEO of Patriot Solutions, LLC. The morning news shows were calling it the biggest government corruption scandal in decades, with early estimates suggesting that over $80 million in taxpayer money had been stolen through fraudulent contracts. I watched the coverage from my tiny apartment, still wearing my grocery store uniform because I had been getting ready for my afternoon shift when the news broke. CNN was running a continuous crawl of names and charges while talking heads debated the implications for government oversight. Fox News had assembled a panel of experts discussing how this level of corruption could have gone undetected for so long. MSNBC was already calling for congressional hearings and demanding to know who had blown the whistle on what they were calling Operation Phantom Contracts. The first mention of my name came during Anderson Cooper's evening broadcast. Sources close to the investigation tell CNN that the original evidence came from a former Treasury Department analyst named Sarah Martinez, who was allegedly fired for pursuing these irregularities despite warnings from supervisors to drop her investigation. Seeing my name on national television felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold on screen. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Sarah, this is your cousin Lisa. We're all watching the news. Is this really you?" Within minutes, I had dozens of messages from relatives, former coworkers, and college friends who had seen the coverage. People who hadn't spoken to me in years were suddenly reaching out, wanting to know if the Sarah Martinez on CNN was really the same person they knew. The media attention intensified over the next few days as more details emerged about the scope of the conspiracy. The Washington Post published a timeline showing how the fraud had operated for over 3 years, systematically draining money from programs meant to protect national security. The New York Times ran a front-page story about the shell company network, complete with charts showing how money had flowed from government contracts to offshore accounts in 7 different countries. By Thursday, reporters were camping outside my apartment building, hoping to get an interview with the whistleblower who had brought down what they were now calling the biggest theft of taxpayer money since the Iraq War reconstruction contracts. I had to sneak out the back entrance to get to work, where my manager informed me that several news crews had already been by the store asking questions about me. The breaking point came when 60 Minutes called to request an on-camera interview. Jennifer Walsh, the same reporter I had originally tried to contact months earlier, wanted to tell my story as part of a special episode about government corruption. "Ms. Martinez," she said during our phone conversation, "the American people deserve to know about the courage it took to expose this conspiracy. You risked everything to protect taxpayer money, and your story needs to be heard." I agreed to the interview, partly because I wanted people to understand what had really happened, but mostly because I needed the world to know that I hadn't been crazy or delusional. For months, I had been dismissed as a conspiracy theorist who couldn't handle the reality of being fired for poor performance. Now I had the opportunity to set the record straight and show that sometimes the family failure actually knows what she's talking about. The interview was scheduled for the following Monday, and 60 Minutes promised it would air that Sunday as part of their special coverage of the corruption scandal. As I prepared for what would likely be the most important conversation of my life, I couldn't help thinking about my family. They had to be seeing the news coverage. They had to know that everything they had dismissed as paranoid fantasies was actually true. But my phone remained silent. No calls, no texts, no acknowledgement that their daughter and sister had just exposed the biggest government fraud in decades. Part of me hoped they were feeling guilty about how they had treated me. But a bigger part of me was preparing for them to find new ways to minimize my role or question my motives. I had learned not to expect anything from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and I wasn't going to let hope make me vulnerable to more disappointment. The congressional hearings began 2 weeks after the arrests, broadcast live on C-SPAN, and covered extensively by every major news network. I watched from my apartment as senators questioned FBI Director Patricia Williams about the scope of the investigation and demanded answers about how such massive fraud could have gone undetected for so long. When Senator Elizabeth Warren asked specifically about the whistleblower who had brought the conspiracy to light, Director Williams praised the courage and patriotism of the individual who risked their career to protect taxpayer money. The turning point came when Congressman Adam Schiff called for a special committee to investigate systemic failures in government oversight. During his opening remarks, he held up a copy of my original evidence packet and said, "This analysis, conducted by a dedicated public servant who was punished for doing her job too well, represents exactly the kind of work we should be celebrating, not silencing." Hearing my investigation described as the work of a dedicated public servant by a sitting congressman felt like vindication after months of being treated like a delusional conspiracy theorist. But it was the president's response that changed everything. 3 weeks after the arrests, as the scandal continued to dominate headlines and congressional hearings revealed the full scope of the corruption, President Biden announced he would address the nation about government accountability and the importance of protecting whistleblowers. The speech was scheduled for Tuesday evening, prime time, carried live by all major networks. I was working my evening shift at the grocery store when my manager told me I could take a break to watch the address on the television in the break room. Several coworkers joined me, knowing that I was somehow connected to the corruption story that had been dominating the news. We gathered around the small TV as the president approached the podium in the East Room of the White House, flanked by American flags and looking directly into the camera with the gravity that major presidential addresses require. "My fellow Americans," he began, 3 weeks ago, federal agents arrested 12 individuals involved in one of the largest theft schemes in our government's history. Over $80 million in taxpayer money was stolen through fraudulent contracts. Money that should have been used to protect our national security and serve the American people. The president outlined the scope of the conspiracy, the systematic theft, and the network of shell companies that had been used to hide the crime. Then he said the words that made my legs give out: forcing me to grab the edge of the break room table for support. This conspiracy might never have been discovered if not for the courage and dedication of former Treasury Department analyst Sarah Martinez, who risked her career and her safety to ensure that this theft of public funds could not continue. My name, spoken by the President of the United States, broadcast live to millions of Americans who were learning for the first time about the woman who had brought down the biggest government fraud in decades. Ms. Martinez exemplifies the best traditions of public service, the president continued, choosing loyalty to the American people over personal comfort or career advancement. When she discovered evidence of systematic fraud, she pursued the truth despite pressure to remain silent. When she was fired for her dedication to protecting taxpayer money, she refused to stay quiet. When her own family questioned her commitment to justice, she chose to serve her country over her personal relationships. The president's mention of my family situation made me realize that someone had briefed him extensively about my personal story. He knew about the isolation, the rejection, the months of living in poverty while the FBI built their case. He understood that exposing this conspiracy had cost me everything I cared about, and he was using his platform to make sure the country understood the price I had paid to protect their money. Tonight, I am announcing that Sarah Martinez will be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest civilian honor, in recognition of her extraordinary service to the American people, the president said. She reminds us that sometimes the most important acts of patriotism happen not on battlefields or in halls of power, but in cubicles and offices where dedicated public servants choose to do what is right, regardless of the personal cost. My phone exploded with notifications before the president had even finished speaking. Text messages, voicemails, social media tags, and missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize filled my screen faster than I could process them. My coworkers were staring at me with a mixture of awe and disbelief, suddenly realizing that the quiet woman who stocked shelves in aisle 7 was about to receive the highest honor the president could bestow on a civilian. But the only calls I cared about were the ones that weren't coming. As America learned my name and my story, as the president praised my courage and dedication, my family remained silent. The people who should have been proudest of what I had accomplished were nowhere to be found, and their absence hurt more than all the months of poverty and isolation combined. The call came at 11:47 p.m., less than 2 hours after the president's address ended. My mother's number flashed on my phone screen for the first time in 8 months, and my hand trembled as I debated whether to answer. When I finally did, her voice was barely a whisper, choked with tears and something that might have been shame. Mija, we saw the president's speech. We had no idea. We thought we didn't understand what you were really doing. Over the next 3 days, my phone rang constantly with calls from family members who had spent months treating me like I was mentally unstable. Miguel called crying, admitting that he had been wrong about everything and begging me to forgive him for not believing me. Carmen left voicemails talking about how proud she was of her sister and how sorry she was for doubting my incredible work. My father, who had accused me of living in Fantasyland, sent a text message that simply said, "I was wrong. Can you ever forgive me?" But it was the family dinner invitation that broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. My mother called on Thursday to tell me they were having a celebration dinner in my honor on Sunday, inviting extended family and friends to properly recognize Sarah's amazing achievement. She wanted to cook all my favorite foods and invite the local newspaper to take pictures of the family of the whistleblower who had brought down government corruption. Suddenly, I was no longer the embarrassing failure they needed to hide. I was the family hero they wanted to claim credit for raising. I sat in my studio apartment listening to my mother plan a party celebrating accomplishments she had dismissed as delusional conspiracy theories just months earlier, and I realized I had a choice to make. I could forgive them, pretend that their abandonment hadn't nearly destroyed me, and return to being the daughter who was grateful for their acceptance. Or I could tell them the truth about what they had put me through and demand that they acknowledge the price of their disbelief. The family dinner was exactly what I expected. A carefully staged performance designed to rewrite history. My parents had invited aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends to celebrate their heroic daughter who had always been so dedicated to justice and doing the right thing. The same relatives who had witnessed my humiliation at the barbecue were now eager to pose for pictures with the Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient and share stories about how they had always known Sarah was special. Miguel gave a toast about how proud he was to have such a courageous and principled sister, conveniently forgetting that he had been the one leading the charge to kick me out of the family. Carmen posted photos on Instagram with captions about family loyalty and standing by each other through difficult times, apparently having forgotten about the 8 months when she had stood by everyone except me. My parents beamed as guests congratulated them on raising such an outstanding daughter, accepting praise for my accomplishments as if they had supported me throughout the entire ordeal. But as I sat at the head of the table, listening to speeches about my courage and dedication from people who had called me crazy and paranoid, I knew I couldn't let them rewrite history. When my father asked me to say a few words about my incredible journey, I stood up and looked around the table at the faces of people who had abandoned me when I needed them most. "There's something you all need to know," I said, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "Everything you think you know about my investigation is wrong. I wasn't a Treasury Department analyst who stumbled onto corruption by accident. I was working undercover for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, specifically assigned to investigate the very fraud I eventually exposed." The room fell silent as I continued. For 2 years, I maintained a cover identity as an ordinary data analyst while conducting a deep investigation into government contractor fraud. My boring job, my modest lifestyle, my willingness to be seen as the family failure, all of it was carefully designed to make me invisible to the criminals I was tracking. The FBI needed someone who could access financial records without raising suspicion, someone who would be overlooked and underestimated. Miguel's face had gone pale as he realized the implications of what I was saying. "You mean, when we thought you were failing at your career, you were actually—" I was risking my life to protect taxpayer money and expose corruption at the highest levels of government, I finished. And when I tried to share even a hint of how important my work was, you decided I was delusional. When the pressure of maintaining my cover became overwhelming, you told me I was an embarrassment to the family. When I lost my job because my investigation was getting too close to the truth, you held an intervention to tell me I was a failure who needed to get my life together. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around the table at people who were finally beginning to understand that they hadn't just doubted my sanity. They had abandoned a federal agent who was working to protect them and millions of other Americans. They had kicked out their daughter and sister precisely when she needed their support most, not because she was failing, but because she was succeeding at something too dangerous and important for them to understand. "So before we celebrate my courage and dedication," I said, "I need you to acknowledge that you failed me when it mattered most. You chose to believe I was crazy rather than trust that I might know what I was talking about. And now I have to decide whether people who treated me that way deserve to be part of my life going forward." The dinner table remained silent for what felt like an eternity. My mother was crying, Miguel had his head in his hands, and Carmen was staring at me like she was seeing a stranger. My father, the man who had told me to face reality and stop living in fantasy land, finally spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, we had no idea. If we had known you were working for the FBI—" "But that's exactly the point," I interrupted. "You should have trusted me because I'm your daughter, not because I had some impressive job title. You should have believed me because you knew my character, not because the president told you I was a hero." I looked around the table one last time at the faces of people who had shaped my entire life, people who had made me question my own sanity when I needed their support most. "I forgave the criminals who tried to destroy my career," I said, standing up from the table. "I forgave the government officials who enabled corruption, but forgiving the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally? That's going to take a lot longer." As I walked toward the door, I heard my mother call out, "Please don't leave, mija. We can fix this." I paused at the threshold, the same spot where I had stood 8 months earlier when they kicked me out of their lives. This time, I was the one with all the power. This time, I was the one deciding who belonged in my family, and this time, they were the ones begging me to stay. Maybe, I said, looking back at the people who had called me a failure while I was saving their country, but it's going to be on my terms now. Some victories taste sweeter than others, but the sweetest revenge? Sometimes it's just proving that the family disappointment was actually the family hero all along. We're grateful you stayed with us. For more stories of women reclaiming their voice, click on the left and subscribe to stay connected. May this be a reminder, your story has power too.